So I will introduce myself. I'm from a member of the Rotary Club, The Hague Metropolitan. It's the first English-speaking club in the Netherlands. Founded some 31 years ago. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary. We did it this year instead of last year because of COVID. I'm a member of this club, and I've been living in the Netherlands for the last 22 years, I think. Anyway, I'll carry on the introduction about myself in part of my presentation, because this presentation will, to a certain extent, introduce me and walk through my life, how I developed my professional career, and how it all happened. I have given the title Chasing a Dream. I was invited to the Rotary Club in Romania to give a few lectures at the Bioterra and University and also one of the high schools. And because I was talking to students and to both pupils in school and students, in a way, they were beginning to have a dream about what they will do in life. I was first invited to give such a talk at Concordia University in Montreal, where I first graduated. And they invited me back a few years ago to give a talk at a summer seminar at the university, and they wanted to have some old alma mater who had had an exciting career. And that's the first time I gave such a talk. So I combined the two titles, Chasing a Dream and Reminiscences of quite an exciting career that I've had. So I'll introduce myself during this talk, as I said, and as you will see here, it starts out from 1 to 6 in country number 1 to 6. And in a way, my career started right from the beginning. I was born in the Middle East, in Alexandria. My father was working at the British and Foreign Bible Society, and I was born there shortly after the peace treaty with Germany, but before the peace treaty with Japan. So that gives you the year, 1945. We were not very far from the German army. We were just a few kilometers out of Alexandria, but they didn't come into the city, fortunately. So we escaped what we figured would be that horror. I graduated, I went to a British school there and graduated from there, and then we went on to Canada. Now, I won't tell you all of this right now because we will walk through it. The place I was in, I really didn't even understand that I was in a foreign country because I didn't know what Egypt or what the Middle East was and who I was. And I spoke English, and I had learned as a child before I went to school how to write a few letters in the alphabet, and I was proud that I had achieved that before I went to school. And I even knew numbers, so I started learning how to add and subtract. And when I went to school the first day, my father gave me a coin, and he said, when you get hungry, there will be a tuck shop where you can buy something small to eat. Not something expensive, because we'll only give you a little bit. And he gave me the coin, and I looked at the coin, and I said, well, now let's see how much this coin is worth. And I looked at it, and I couldn't read it. It had some strange hieroglyphics on it. And I said, what on earth is that? I've just learned the letters of the alphabet, and I can't read this. What are these designs? And he said, oh, this is in Arabic. And I said, why? He said, because this is the language of the country. I said, what? What country? And he said, we are living in Egypt. And I said, oh, I thought we were in England. And he said, no. I was totally disappointed. I didn't know even where we were. I knew that there were natives in the streets, and I didn't know. Natives looked a little bit different from us, but that was all. I didn't really realize I was far away And I thought, oh, this is terrible, I'm far away. And it was an awful feeling, actually, because I suddenly realized that some way, somehow, I wasn't home. It was a very disconcerting for me that I was in a place where I didn't even understand the language. I couldn't read it, I couldn't write it. And some way, somehow, I was different. This is where more or less it's located. I was here. Where my father came from, he was born over there in a country called Turkey, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. And because of some horrible occurrences there, the first, one might say, fascist regime, where they began to hunt people who were different from them, namely all the Christians, and most of a lot of the Christians, especially in this area, were either killed or ethnically cleansed. And my father, as a child, was able to escape with the shirt on his back, but not much more, and having lost most of his family. And he took refuge in Aleppo and worked there as a child, and finally was able to, very luckily, get a job with the British and Foreign Bible Society in Egypt, where he moved and became a manager there. My mother's parents, my mother's father was born in Adana, Turkey, and he left during the first parts of the genocide in 1895. My father left in 1915, but he left earlier, and married in America, and then afterwards came back and lived in Cyprus, where my mother was born, and then they got married, and that's where my parents lived for almost 40 years and where I was born. And then we finally, after things got rather uncomfortable in Egypt and we were no longer welcome there, we decided to leave and moved on to Canada. This was around the corner from where we lived. There were some, the Romans had been there earlier, as were the Greeks, and these were some of the remnants. I would really love to give a lecture on this wonderful country, which I did not feel very welcome when I was there, but I went back there and I really feel it is one of a country with rich history. If I had time, I would give a lecture on my time that I spent there and what I learned about this country. It was very exciting. We even have some small sphinxes there. These are the catacombs where the Christians were and other similar groups were buried, and very interesting place where they mixed Christian, Roman, Greek, pagan emblems all together. So multiple heritage. The city is an interesting city, and when I lived there, it was a kingdom which, and very briefly, suffered a revolution in 1952. And the revolution actually happened mainly on the street where we lived. We were living on the main street and we could watch the so-called demonstrations against the king. And the new president-to-be was from Alexandria, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he also, he led his demonstrations and had the people on those streets. The king was then deposed and drove by, probably by our house, I'm not sure, and escaped to from one of his palaces in the northeast to another palace in the southwest of the city, and we lived somewhere in between. And he sensibly decided not to fight and not to try to shed any blood, and both sides decided not to shed any blood, and this was a bloodless revolution, as one did it in those days. The Egyptians were fairly peaceful, and it was still a fairly tumultuous time. This is Nasser with many of his supporters and demonstrators. I saw him on the street a couple of times. And this is the street in a more peaceful time with our taxi, so to speak. I did go to school. That's me in school as a youngster. And then later on, when the school was taken over by the government, we had to have our militia training so that we could learn to support the next war against the damn Brits. So we were in a bit of an awkward position because we were a British school and the school ended up being nationalized. The headmaster decided he would resign and give it up to the government, which disappointed us immensely, but he felt he had no alternative. And one of the Egyptian generals would teach us military training, how to shoot and how to engage in be good soldiers. Of course, my parents were terrified that we would be called up into the military, and so we had to finally leave the country. Although my father loved his job working as a missionary with the Bible Society, he decided that we would have to leave. This is more or less in a nutshell. So my first dream, you might say, for my profession was outside of our window in Alexandria when I looked at the clear skies and saw all the stars and wondered, what were these stars? What are they? I didn't even know what they were. Were these windows to heaven? What were they? I really wasn't sure, and I asked many questions as a 5-year-old. And I began to learn. There were stars, there were planets. Planets reflected light, they were cold. Stars were burning like our sun. And my dream was, I wanted to understand this all, and I wondered whether we could even get there one day. And these were the questions I asked before I went to school as a 4 or 5-year-old. And once I went to school, I wasn't quite content with our curriculum, which was very boring, you know, learning geography and whatnot. But I went to the local library, thanks the Americans. They had a United States Information Service they had set up in the city. And I was able to read a lot of books. And I read a bit of Jules Verne, especially his trip to the moon. I read about others who were also inspired by Jules Verne. There were various people. The Russian Tsiolkovsky was very inspired, and he had the first rocket ideas with liquid fuel propulsion. Now, what is important about liquid fuel propulsion is you can control it, while solid state propulsion, you can't. You start it off, and then the rocket will have to burn it right through. And a lot of the rockets were built that way in those days, because it was the simplest way of doing things. And he very early on designed such a rocket, but he didn't really get to do tests. He did write some science fiction, which is wonderful. A scientist who designs rockets and also writes science fiction. I read also other books. You can imagine I liked reading other things than what they told me at school to read, because school curriculum is by definition usually made to put pupils to sleep and to make sure they forget everything that they learn. I don't really wonder why they teach anything to the pupils. Robert Goddard in America was also a very good engineer and scientist, and he also designed liquid fuel rockets and even flew some. So he really did some pioneering work. He proposed that we could get to the moon, and he was criticized for it and laughed at. But later on, the New York Times apologized, but it was a bit too late. He had already died. There were others too. In Germany, Hermann Oberth, who was born in actually Transylvania, that is more Romania today. He also is considered in a way the father of spaceflight, but he also engaged in science fiction. These were really interesting characters. And when Fritz Lang, one of the most famous German cinematographic experts of the day wanted to make a science fiction film, Frau im Mond, he asked Hermann Oberth, can we launch a rocket on the day that I launched my film? And Hermann Oberth said, you know, I'm designing a rocket. We'll try to launch it. So on the day of the film, Hermann Oberth tried to launch a rocket. Well, it was a bit premature and the rocket exploded, and poor Hermann Oberth lost one of his eyes as a result. But this was the enthusiasm that these scientists, and they mixed with art, they mixed with this cinema, they really tried to put life to they wrote literature, they were multifunctional, multivariant, and multidisciplinary, and very exciting. And these were the people who inspired me. Hermann Oberth, one of his assistants was, well, before we get to that, Sergei Korolev was one of the early developers and chief designers of the Soviet rocketry, and he actually succeeded in winning the race, sending the first dogs into space and the first human into space. So Korolev was really one of the, you might say, successful pioneers who succeeded in starting the so-called space race. And this space race was continued on by Werner von Braun, who had been working with Hermann Oberth, and he went to America after the war, and he immediately wanted to start a human spaceflight program, but the Americans weren't interested. It was only once Korolev had his success and had the first dogs in space and then the first human in space, the first satellites in space, that the Americans agreed with Werner von Braun to start the American space program. I remember days in school when the first Sputnik went up. We who had studied mathematics and physics would spend our time after classes to try to calculate the orbit. At what angle would the rocket have to go up? How would it counter all the friction? Would it get into orbit? How much fuel would it need? These were the things we tried to solve as pupils. Nowadays, pupils do different things. But these were the kind of problems. I remember we couldn't do all our calculations. And I had a friend from the church who was going to university, and I asked him to come to our school after hours and teach us calculus, because they didn't want to teach us this in the class. It was not part of the curriculum. So we learned calculus ourselves as pupils in order to understand how these orbits were calculated. And we used to debate when the Russians had their first man in space, we didn't believe them. He said, these Soviets have just invented it. They've only told us they are there. And I remember we looked at pictures of Titov, who was external to the spacecraft, and he had done an EVA, an extravehicular activity. And we said, this looks like a string attached to him. He could be underwater. It could be simulated underwater. That's probably what the damn Soviets have done. They didn't go there. They're fooling us. So we really had a great suspicion. We were debating, is it true? Is it fake? Is it fake news? Is it not fake news? We were used to this fake news because the Egyptian government in those days was giving us all kinds of fake news. And I remember when the British were bombing Egypt in 1956, and one plane was shot down over Alexandria. I saw it. The next morning, in the papers were written, Egyptian artillery shoots down 28 British planes over Alexandria. And I thought, well, yes. They did shoot down one, but I don't think it was more than that. So this was roughly the exaggeration we saw. And we see it today, but I don't want to get into politics. It's happening on both sides, unfortunately. But this was happening back then, and we were very much suspicious. Any news in the newspaper we had to take with 25 grains of salt before we believed it. And therefore, we certainly didn't believe most of what the Soviets talked about, because a lot of it was rubbish. But they did get somebody into space, and the Americans were very jealous, and one of the senators even wrote a poem when the Russians succeeded in sending the first satellite. Oh, little Sputnik flying high, with man made in Moscow deep. You tell the world it's a commie sky, and Uncle Sam, to speak, Uncle Sam is American. You say on their way and on rough, the Kremlin knows it all. We hope our golfer, that's Eisenhower, who played golf a lot, knows enough to get us on the ball. So the Americans were very embarrassed, and they invested a hell of a lot to start their space program, and they did a magnificent job. Here was Gagarin, who went into space, and we see later on how the Americans very quickly caught up. And although they didn't make it the first human to space, they certainly made the first human on the moon. And when you imagine that they started only 9 years earlier to send a satellite for the first time into space, and in 9 years, they succeeded in landing on the moon, that was a great achievement. So,
I have a question.
Yes.
Because I was thinking that Armstrong was the first one on the moon.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
In 69, isn't it?
Yes. 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 Sorry, you're right. This Armstrong is not the first. I only put Buzz Aldrin and John Glenn because I knew John Glenn personally, and Buzz Aldrin and John Young. And these were 3 astronauts whom I worked with. So I just gave that as an example, but you're absolutely right.
I don't know them. So
you are absolutely right.
But I don't know. I just know the names. I know only
it's misleading. Yes, I decided to show only the people I had worked with in my presentation.
Okay.
But yes, you're absolutely right. Actually, I did meet Armstrong once, but I don't know him personally. He wouldn't have known who I was, at least with John Glenn. But well, Buzz Aldrin I met, but I don't think he would remember me. John Young was on the same flight that our European astronauts were. And John Glenn, a wonderful person. I met him before he died, before he actually flew the last time in space. So, yes, you're absolutely right. Armstrong was the first man to take a step on the moon in 1969. So, here, my next country I went to, this is after all these dreams. This is what I was doing at school, reading about all these people. And when I went to university, we went to Canada, that was the time I registered for university. Now I couldn't afford it, so I had to work full-time, 40 hours a week, and study in the evenings. So this was not a very easy life. But when I went to register, I had an interview with a professor, a very wise mathematics professor. And he said to me, "Young man, what is it you want to study so we can register you properly?" And I said, "Well, I know what I want to study." He said, "Well, you want to study physics, engineering, science, what is it?" I said, "Well, I'm not sure what you call it, but I know what I want to do." He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to work in the human spaceflight program. And I want to do human spaceflight." And he said, "We don't do human spaceflight at this university." I said, "But yeah, but you asked me a question and I answered it. That's what I want to do." He said, "Well, why don't you shut your eyes for a few minutes and dream yourself 20 years into the future, and you are doing your dream job, you have chased and reached your dream, and then tell me a 10-minute time slot of one of your most interesting activities that you're doing. And then I'll tell you what to study, how to get there." Interesting. So I shut my eyes. And after a couple of minutes, I opened them. I said, "I know what it is." He said, "What?" I said, "Well, I'm dreaming that I'm sitting in a dark room. There are no windows." He looked at me. "What?" I said, "That's not a problem. I have a monitor in front of me, and I have earphones on and a chart recorder. Study physics. And that's the natural language of science. Physics and math, that'll equip you." I said, "Fine." So I studied physics and mathematics. And this was the dream in a sense. I found this picture and I thought, this is exactly, it's a little bit different in a sense, but this is how I was dreaming. And what's interesting in this dream is actually, in many ways, this is what happened in the future. This drawing was made actually during the time we did our first space program, where sponsored by the European Space Agency and NASA, we combined a group of 100 scientists across the world, mainly the Western world, to work together in a space lab, cylinder, which we sent on the space shuttle, and holding all our experiments, some 100 experiments. And this lab was in space, and the European Space Agency had thought in those days of having an extra tethered, another laboratory flying, in a way that represented my dream. I've studied at Concordia University and did physics and mathematics, got my bachelor's degree there, and then I went on to my next country. The reason was, part of my dream was not simply to work in human spaceflight, but was to visit and live in certain countries. And America, Britain, Germany were on my list. And as America was just across the border, it was the easiest one. So I decided to go to the States, and I got a scholarship and studied at the University of Michigan and did my master's degree in physics in the beautiful city of Ann Arbor, Michigan. A wonderful place, actually one of the few cities where you can get around by bicycle. And I had a bicycle, and every day rode to the university on my two-gear bicycle. The middle gear wasn't working. I bought the bicycle for $15, so it wasn't very expensive, but that's all I could afford. And then I wanted to do my doctoral research, and I was interviewed by a professor who was searching for the building blocks of matter and using a cloud chamber, and the biggest cloud chamber in the world was in Great Britain. I'll tell you what a cloud chamber is. And he asked me whether I would be willing to go to England. I said, yes, that's on my list. I said, it's more or less my home country. I said, I've never been there, but it's my home country, because it's the country of my literature, my language, my everything. And he said, fine, fine. So a month later, I was on the plane, this time by plane. When I first went to Canada, we went by ship. I didn't go by plane. We crossed the ocean on a ship. We first went through various countries. That was very interesting. Stopped in Italy and Portugal. Well, Portugal was a very dictatorship at the time, so we only stopped outside the harbor and got our supplies by small boat. And I flew. That was my first flight. Well, not quite, but almost. And went to Leeds, England, where this wonderful cloud chamber was at the university. What is a cloud chamber? It's, for those of you who don't know, when particles, cosmic particles, there are cosmic particles coming through from everywhere, intergalactic. And they're coming through our atmosphere and landing here. And here and now, there are some thousands of particles that have come through while we are sitting here and gone through our bodies. What damage it has done, we don't know, but it does do some damage, and that's probably why we don't live that long. We wanted to study these particles. They are very high energy particles. They are not we have an accelerator in CERN, which is very powerful, but these particles are even more powerful than that. And why we needed these very powerful particles? Because they can hit a target and break up, and maybe we can see the building blocks of matter. And we were searching for what we thought was the 1/3 electron charge particle, quark. And we thought we could find it. The theorists said it must exist, and we were looking for that smallest particle which experiences all four forces of nature. And this particle, when it goes through such a cloud chamber, it will break through the molecules. These molecules will break up into positive and negative ions. And if we turn on an electric current, they will separate themselves. And if we expand the chamber suddenly, the temperature will drop and the humidity will collect on these ions. And then we'll be able to count them and see how many negative, how many positive, and see whether they are fewer than what other particles. A proton will give a certain number, but a quark will give 1/9 because it's 1/3 and it works as the power, power of 2. So we were looking for these particles. We took pictures in stereo, huge cameras, 8-inch film, very slow film because we wanted to get the smallest recording. And we needed a lot of light. So we needed a very bright flash because we wanted to have as slow film as possible to take as accurate pictures as possible. Not like our digital cameras today, but 1,000 times more accurate. And the only way we could do that was to use a lot of capacitance. You know, when you are taking a picture, your battery takes a lot of the battery out to make a flash. And in the old days, you may remember, some of you, there was a special, to give a flash, you would burn through your flash bulb to give enough light. And in those days, we had to give enough capacitance to light up the whole, we had an enclosed room where the chamber was in. The chamber was 1.5 by 1.5 by 1.5 meters. And we had a room about 5 by 5 by 5 meters in order to house it. And we had to light up this room very brightly. And the only thing we could use were capacitors that were used in the Second World War to light up the ground when they were flying over enemy territory. Yeah? They had no other way than to have a giant flash to take a picture of the ground under them. And they had crates of capacitors on these planes, sometimes 1/2 ton of capacitors in order to take a picture and then charge them up again. And we collected a lot of these capacitors from Army surplus. They had not thrown them out. And we had, I would say, a row of these crates almost from here to the end of the room, which all together, it must have been a few hundred kilos of capacitors to make one flash and take a very, very bright picture. These are the kinds of things we did. And the cameras we used are also World War II cameras, which were used on planes. We had about six of these stereo cameras, which simultaneously, and I spent my evenings developing this film. We took turns. We had to replace the film in the cameras. So we all took turns. I often was till midnight in the laboratory. Weekends, the cloud chamber run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it was very hard work to collect data. Very exciting time. We didn't find the quark. But now I realize it wasn't findable because it cannot exist by itself. It is not exactly conceptual, but you cannot really see it by itself. It always exists together with other particles to form one electron charge. But I won't go into that. We are going to go into the next phase of my career. So once I've got my PhD, I decided I would go to the next step of my dream, which was to go to another country. It was between France and Germany. France, because I thought it was a good language to learn and a beautiful country. Germany, because a country that has created Beethoven, Einstein, and the experts in human spaceflight, and also Hitler, was a very strange place. I thought, I have to try to understand this place. I want to understand it. Well, the French, fortunately or unfortunately, didn't answer any of my letters because they don't tend to answer letters very quickly. The Germans answered within 48 hours, apologizing for the very long delay. French, after 3 weeks, didn't even apologize. So Germany was the next stop. And I stopped in Mainz, where I joined the Max Planck Institute in nuclear physics, and started a career in nuclear physics. Well, they were already working on an experiment that they'd been working on for 6 years, and I was on the 7th year with them. And they had not yet started collecting data. They were preparing the experiment. They were preparing their Van de Graaff accelerator, and they were preparing all the electronics. It took a long, long time. And when I got there, they had just started, a few days after I arrived, the first data collection. And it was the last year of their financing. The professor had gotten an extension to work until 70 years old, but he said no more extensions. So after 6 years of preparation, we collected 1 year, well, 1.25 years of data. And then we had to close down because financing had ended and the professor had to retire. This is the way it works. Now, I thought to myself, it's going to take 7 years to do an experiment. This is not the kind of thing I want to spend my life doing. And I said, I wanted to understand the human being. I wanted to understand not just the quark, but the universe. I wanted to understand the human body. I wanted to understand what brings life. I said, I'm just not achieving anything, but just sitting here years and years trying to plan an experiment. And I told my professor that at the University Nuclear Physics Department, where I had then accepted a job. And I told him I was frustrated. I had to move on. I was not getting to the next steps of my dream. And he said, I've got just the right thing for you. I said, what? He said, you wait. I'll tell you tomorrow. The next day I saw him and he said, okay, it should work out, he said. Go across the road to the Faculty of Medicine, the Institute of Neurophysiology, and talk to such and such a professor. He has the right job. I said, did you say Faculty of Medicine? He said, yes. Neurophysiology? He said, yes. I said, well, I'm not an expert. He said, the job is for you. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You're a physicist. Neurophysiology you can do in the evenings, and that shouldn't be a problem. So I went to see this professor, and he said to me, he interviewed me for about 10 minutes, asking me about myself. And then said, well, when can you start? And I said, well, just a minute. You haven't even asked me whether I know how to spell neurophysiology. He said, no, I didn't ask you, but I'm sure you can figure out how to spell it and you can figure out the details. I just wanted to know when you could start. So I was rather surprised. And he said, well, I was told you're a very good physicist by this professor that came to me yesterday. He was my neighbor. You're a professor in the nuclear physics department. And he told me you were very good. And a person who is a good physicist can surely learn medicine and neurophysiology. That's not the problem. Actually, I want somebody who can actually plan experiments and do things. And he said, the exciting thing about it is we are doing sensory perception. I said, oh, we are testing the vestibular system, how the otoliths work, how we sense linear acceleration and gravity, and how we sense the semicircular canals, how we sense rotational acceleration. And the best way to do this is when we don't have the damned gravity of the Earth. We're going to do this in spaceflight. I said, spaceflight, yes. That's the next step of my dream. So everything was fitting together. It was wonderful. I said, great. I said, if you'll take me, I'll take the job. So he said, fine. So he wanted me to start the next day, and I said, no, I was just planning my vacation, but he allowed me to have a 3-week vacation, and then I started my job. And we'll go on. And so I entered the institute the first day. That's not a picture of the institute, but I entered the institute on the first day. And I had my coat on because it was a chilly day. And I went to see the secretary because I knew where her office was. And I said, could you tell me where my office is? Well, I was told I would have an office in a laboratory. And she said, not yet. I said, why not? She said, you have to first see the professor. And I thought, oh, is he having second thoughts about me? So I went in to see the professor. I said, I was told not to take my coat off. What does this mean? And he said, that means the professor, I'm going to put my coat on and we're going out. I said, oh. He said, well, we're going to another part of our laboratory. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, here are the boring things. Here are the offices and the laboratories and these rooms and things. But we are going to do something a bit more exciting. And I'll show you what I find much more fun. I said, oh, what is that? So we got into his car and we drove to the nearest airport. And he showed me an airplane. And he said, well, that's our institute's airplane. That's part of our laboratory. And now we're going to do some what we call parabolic flight. I said, oh? He said, you know what a parabola is? You're a physicist. I said, yes, I know. And he said, you know, when you go up in a parabola, at some point you're weightless. I said, yes. He said, well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do some acrobatic flying. So he took me on the plane. I had to put on all kinds of instruments because we had to have an excuse in measuring my heartbeat and my lungs and God knows what else. And I sat in the back with all these pile of instruments around me. He sat in the front, it was a four-seater. He took off and then started accelerating upwards. 4G, and you can imagine what 4G meant. 4G means 4 times your weight. Well, when you're 4 times your weight, suddenly, even your cheek begins to be pulled down, and your stomach goes down, and everything else is compressed like you've never been compressed before. I'm suddenly, instead of weighing 65 kilos, I'm weighing 250 kilos. That's more or less what it means, 4G. Awful. And I felt my eyes, my brain, everything was being pulled down. I could hardly breathe. And then parabola came. Then suddenly I found myself almost rising to the top of the plane, and all my innards and breakfast was almost coming up. And then the whole thing repeated itself again. And I thought, oh my God, and again, and again. And after 5 parabola, he started going straight and he said, are you okay? I said, yeah, I think so. Oh, he said, great. Then we'll do another 5. I did another 5. And I didn't really know at the end whether I was female or male, human or a dog. I was feeling so terrible. And he said, how are you feeling? I said, well, no, not quite so good. I think my breakfast is showing up. He hadn't given me a doggy bag. And unfortunately, my breakfast did come up. It was horrible. The floor of the plane was filled with my breakfast and my supper of the day before and everything else that you could imagine. And very sheepishly, I got out of the plane. I could hardly walk. And he very kindly cleaned the mess up himself. And he said, well, you know what? Why don't you just go home and take the day off? Well, that was my first day of work. I didn't see my lab or my office. I was afterwards the next day. I didn't see it. Now, for those of you, how many medical doctors or physiology people? Anybody? These are the otoliths. And these are kind of, you can imagine that they're like hairs with little weights on them, all in a messy, gluish, amorphous, semi-fluid, semi-gel-like substance. And when you tilt your head back, these will kind of bend downwards under the weight, and this bending will tell you that you feel that you've bent. Yeah? Or if you are accelerating forwards, you'll get the same feeling. And actually, you'll get the same identical feeling whether you are accelerated forwards or only tilted backwards. And in fact, you cannot tell the difference. But most of us can. Why? Because you're sitting in a car and you know what's happening. The semicircular canals are a little bit different. They are at more or less right angles to each other, the 3 dimensions. very beautifully built. And when you accelerate in a circular manner, the fluid flows in one or the other direction. And it presses against the membrane, and then you understand roughly from the 3 circular vectors how you are accelerating around in a circular 3-dimensional manner. And the combination of the two help us understand our position, sensory, movement, etc. Now, that does not mean that if these organs are destroyed, you're going to fall over. Because in fact, your whole body has proprioceptors. Where under your feet, you feel something, your knees, everything else, you're feeling where you are. And I tested one person who had all her vestibular system removed because of some terrible disease in both ears. Nothing working. And she was able to walk with her eyes shut forwards and backwards without falling over. Why? Because her whole body is like, in a sense, perceives such things. So it is possible for us to survive. Very interesting area, because for me it translated linear acceleration, angular acceleration. This is physics and mathematics and physiology and neurophysiology all mixed together. So we built, actually, a sled on the Earth. This is a sled. And here is what we built. We called it a vestibular helmet, which had all kinds of instruments to suit 7 different experiments, because to be cheaper and to allow different scientists, we have to plan experiments to allow what many people want to do, and many different scientists. So here, this long thing here is one of the first digital cameras made on the face of the Earth. 200 by 200 pixels. You can imagine, the blobs so big.
Which year was that?
It was in 1981.
Right.
Now, we could have taken a video camera, a Vidicon, which would have been much, much better quality. But because millions had been given for the development of this camera, we had to use this digital camera. It was a Fairchild's camera, but it was put together by a French company in Grenoble. And it was, because it was supported internationally by the European Space Agency, the French Space Agency, and NASA, we had to really use that camera. It was a big mistake, but that's one of those things. And then we have many other instruments. I won't tell you all about those instruments because it would take the whole hour. But we wanted to accelerate people on the ground and have them tell us with a joystick what the movement forward and backward was. Now, you would think when a sled is going to and forth, then they will push the joystick forward and backward as the sled moves to and forth. But they won't, because they will get totally confused. Because when you're moving forward, if you are totally absorbed and totally supported, so you don't really know what direction, you might think you are tilting. Now, what I did was, I first did an experiment on subjects, students at the university, and I told them, we are going to take them to a huge cavernous room where a special seat can move in any direction, and then they will have to tell us what direction it's moving and when. So in order to fool them, I blindfolded them perfectly, then took them into the elevator, took them out, took them on the street in the campus, walked around a few hundred meters, came back, took them back in the elevator, and then brought them back to our laboratory where we had a sled and put them into the sled, all blindfolded. And it was very difficult, climbing into this thing where you had to climb and get in, etc., etc. And then I accelerated them forwards and backwards, almost at the threshold of perception. And indeed, as we thought, they would get confused and they said, well, we think we're going upwards. Why? Because they thought they were tilting backwards. And this is what we call the Hilltop Illusion. And this is very important because actually, this is what caused the deaths of many pilots. Why? When a pilot is flying a plane, of an aircraft carrier. He is accelerated forwards very rapidly. What they do is they have either a big elastic band or some other instrument pushing them. So you put the plane in its full power and it's held back. And then you release the holding back and the plane takes off. And what happens is the pilot thinks the plane is going upwards. And he sees, oh my God, I'm going upwards. I have to try to not go, because if I go too high, I stall and I can start falling back down. So he tries to correct for it and goes a bit forward and he dives into the water because he's actually not going upwards. He's going straight. He's going only a few degrees up, but he has the illusion that he's going much higher. And this was causing a lot of pilots, when they took off from aircraft carriers in the war, to dive into the water. So they had to be trained. Don't believe your senses. You will be fooled. Remember, you are not going too high. Just believe that you aren't. And it was very difficult for them to believe that. They said, just look at the instrument, see the instrument. You will see, believe your instruments, don't believe your feelings. So this is part of what we do get fooled by these things. Anyway, this is Reinhard Furrer. Unfortunately, he got killed in an airplane accident, but I won't talk about that. He was flying on a mission that we had in 1985. Just to understand, this is an example of the history of ballistics. These were the equations that we were writing as pupils in school, trying to understand them because we were trying to understand our space flights. And this is what parabolic flight means. Typically speaking, it's going roughly about 30,000 feet from here to here. It goes up there, and then you're having your zero, we call it zero G, but it's not zero G. It's weightlessness coming down, and then you get out of this parabola, and this is where you again feel very, very strong gravity. Now, when we do this in a big plane like this one, we don't go at 4G, we go at about 2 to 2.5 G, so it's not so bad. But this is what we roughly do in our parabolic flight campaigns. And we have to test, we try to test most of our experiments and the astronaut crew as they were doing the experiments, that they can do them under weightlessness. And we used various different planes. This is ESA's Airbus. I have not been on that one. This is NASA's KC-135, which is like a 707 Boeing, but it has no windows. You may not notice it there. And it's all padded with thick padding, because when you are weightless, you can be knocking anywhere. And this is a Caravelle, which is a fairly large plane, a bit smaller than that one, which we also used in Europe. It was a French plane that the French Space Agency had. Magnificent planes. Some people don't get sick. Unfortunately, I was a person who constantly got sick, but I still didn't give up. I flew all those planes many times. The NASA plane, I think I must have flown a dozen times at least. The Caravelle 2 or 3 times, and some other planes. Even here in Holland, when I moved here, I flew a small plane here as a passenger, not a pilot. Although I have piloted, but unofficially. After 20 years, I found myself in the various NASA centers. Marshall Space Flight Center, which is actually the main center where most of the development first took place for the rockets, and it is located in, usually these are located in a military base. And this is where we trained our astronauts. Dryden is where the shuttle generally landed. Why? It didn't land in Cape Canaveral in Florida because the runway is not very long there. So in the early days, when the shuttle was flying, because we were not sure how to land the shuttle, we wanted to have a long landing place. And Dryden, Edwards Air Force Base, had a huge, long, extra long salt fields, and this was a very good landing place to test planes. So this is where a lot of hobbyists as well as research flights take place in Edwards, an exciting place. I remember seeing one plane that had only 2 wheels, and it was a little one, and the pilot would start the engine, run by the plane, and once the plane started with its nose going up, he would jump into it and then fly off. So there were all kinds of interesting little planes that people were playing with. This was a most interesting place. We then took the space shuttle over on a bigger plane, something the size of a 747, and carried it back to Cape Canaveral where it could take off. And that's the space shuttle landing at Edwards Air Force Base. We did a lot of our work there. We had to take measurements on the astronauts before flight, in flight, and then after flight, and see what changes. So we needed to be there right when the astronauts landed. So as soon as they landed, they came first to us within minutes of landing. And NASA didn't like that, but we insisted on that, and we got our way. And they did a very brief test of 3 or 4 minutes and saw that they were healthy, and then gave them over to us, and then we were able to do our physiological tests on them. Then, together with a lot of equipment, we flew directly from Dryden to Cape Canaveral and landed in the middle of the NASA Center, John F. Kennedy Space Center. That caused a lot of problems. Normally, you have to enter the Space Center from the entrance and show your badge. Well, they were a bit annoyed at us when we turned up at the entrance, but from the wrong side. And they said, but you haven't picked up your badges. How did you get in? We said, we flew in, but you're not supposed to. I said, yeah, but this was a special circumstance. So we had to explain everything. They wanted to arrest us, but they finally realized that we had landed inside the base, and we had to get out from inside the base because we had to take our measurements first. And so these were the kinds of things which we were doing, a lot of firsts that had never been done before. Very exciting. As a matter of fact, the mission itself, this is where I had to, well, it took off from Kennedy Space Flight Center. And then we did our communications with the crew in Houston. And you remember, Houston, we have a problem. That's Houston, the place. And that was my dream about that dark room with my displays and everything. And I almost lived in that dark room for a few weeks because we were monitoring our flight. And in those days, both the European Space Agency and NASA did not have enough personnel to communicate with the crew about our experiments and to train them. So we spent time, and I was the main person. So sometimes I was talking with the astronaut crew 5 or 6 hours in one day. So most people would give their right tooth to say hello and get somebody saying hello back. But I remember I had to identify myself as saying experiment 201 to payload specialist 1. Or I would say really PS1, payload specialist 1, this is ES201. And you have to identify him, PS1, and then the name of your experiment, ES201. And I remember the answer would be, hey, Jim, hi, how are you? Because they would recognize my voice. But everybody else, the hundreds of other people listening, because there were at least 40 different circuits, people listening to see what was going on, didn't even know who ES201 was and who Jim Kass was. But Ulf Merbold, who was flying, knew exactly who I was, so he recognized my voice. So that was very nice in those days, that although Ulf would not recognize many of the NASA voices, they recognized mine. So those are the fun days. And it happened roughly in 1980, well, the flight took off actually early 1983. We had started the training on the base in 1982. And it was roughly 20 years, almost to the day of my interview with the professor. What would I do 20 years later? So it is possible, if you dream strongly enough, that the dream will come true almost to the right time sometimes even. This is the first space lab mission we had. this person there is me, with a big beard. Now, it's not that I wanted to say something political or ideological. I just was too lazy to shave. And the beard grew and grew and grew until it got in the way and I couldn't eat properly. Everybody thought I was trying to say something and I wasn't. Not everybody who has a beard has it to say something about his character or whatever. For me, I didn't like shaving, I still don't. This is Owen Garrett. He flew in Skylab for I think it was 70 days or so. There were a few others. That's Ulf Merbold, the first West German astronaut. So there were some interesting people there. This is a group of scientists we had. So the first mission, this is our crew and the various people on it. I won't talk very much about it, but very interesting people. Owen Garrett from Skylab, John Young from the Moon, Ulf Merbold, the first West German. So there were a lot of firsts which we experienced. It was a very interesting time. I also met when I was later on, but I'll talk about it, other firsts. The next mission we had the first Dutch astronaut. Sorry?
Dutch astronaut.
Yes, that's Hugo Akkels. He was a good friend of mine, but unfortunately he died prematurely. And Reinhard Furr, who afterwards died in the Berlin air show. He was flying an airplane and something was wrong with the plane and ended up crashing and killing him. But this first Dutch astronaut. I then moved on. The institute closed. The professor had to retire. Even though he got extensions until he was 70, he was finally told he had to retire. So everything stopped, all our wonderful work. And as is often the case, after a lot of investment, everything abruptly stops. So I moved to the space industry. I decided I had spent some years in academia and I wanted to see what industry was about. And I was offered 2 jobs at the German Space Agency, but a company in Bremen, the owner of the company, called me several times on the phone and begged me to come and join him. And I thought, well, the chaps at the German Space Agency didn't phone me several times, and he has phoned me several times. I think I'll go there. And he offered me a higher salary too. And I was curious about what was going on. Maybe it was a mistake. It would have been very interesting to go to the German Space Agency, and I would have probably worked for Ulf Merbold and done a lot of interesting research. But anyway, that's one of those things. I made that decision and went there. And but being a person who had a dream, I decided to try things that were for the first time. And I wrote a proposal to the European Space Agency regarding an analysis of what kind of tasks, typical tasks, crew will do in a space station and how we should plan for them. And there was a call for proposals, and most of the big space companies, British Aerospace and the Italian space, the German space, Ariane Space, all of the big companies, there were 5 different big companies, all of them humongous places, wrote proposals, as well as the small company I worked on, which had only 12 people in those days. I was, I think, number 13. And believe it or not, my little proposal from this little company beat all those giants, and we got the proposal, we got the job. I think the difference was I had had hands-on experience and none of them had it. They could write beautiful long proposals, but they could see from my proposal that I had the real experience. That was the first proposal I'd written in my life, so I had no experience. So it does show that it is possible. And not only that, I decided in this proposal I would include trying to bring in experience from where? From our, what was then ceased to be an enemy country, that is the Soviet Union, to try to bring in cosmonaut experience. I said, how are we going to do things? We should also learn from them. we have enough. So I had American astronauts, and I included 2 Soviet astronauts and 2 European astronauts as part of the team, not exactly part of the team, but part of the people who would be interviewed. And they liked my proposal. They thought it was great. And I arranged the first collaborative effort between the USSR and the Soviet Space Agency and the European Space Agency, which was very, very exciting. It was an interesting time. My first visit to Star City, seeing how things work there. I could give a lecture about that, the anecdotes. It was interesting seeing how how one worked. You know, one thinks of a place which is staid, they have their rules, they're inflexible, but they have their ways of getting around the rules. And I remember just one anecdote in Star City, which helps illustrate the character and culture. When we walked in, I thought they would give us all badges as NASA equivalents, so they would know who they were. They didn't give us any badges. And I said, why not? They said, they'll recognize you. There are not so many foreigners coming. They know who everybody is. Nobody walked around in badges. At NASA, everybody has badges. You can't walk around without a badge. And there we were in Star City, entering the Holy of the Holies, and not a person in sight wearing a badge. I was a bit surprised. And I remember one evening, we wanted to do some measurements. We had not finished our work during the day, and we had to do some more measurements in the evening. And we told them, we have to go in once again. We were living in the giant area of Smart City, but the inner part, the real astronaut part, it had its separate guards and were guarded. We have to go in there to do some measurements. They said, no way. Once you've come out, you can't go in again in the evening. It's not allowed. I said, but we have to do our work. What are we going to do? They said, well, we'll arrange something for you. Come back in the evening and we'll figure something out. So we came back in the evening at 8 o'clock after supper and said, okay, how are we going to get in? They said, well, we're going to take you in. They took us 200 meters from the entrance. We walked along the barbed wire fence. And somewhere along the line, similar to here in the dunes, we saw the sand and earth had kind of eroded on the ground, and there was a space under the fence. And he said, are you able to crawl under there? I looked at it. Crawl under there? They said, yes. I said, but is this, but what's this about? They said, this is the way you enter in the evening, because you're not allowed to go through the gate. We can't allow you through the gate. I said, but why do you have this? They said, well, some of the children who want to see their parents who are working in there, that's the way they crawl under, because children are not allowed in. So if they crawl here, then they have not passed through the gate. I said, but don't you know they're doing it? He said, yes, we know that, but we are not responsible. Then we won't be punished for it. So we got down on our knees, and as I'd had my military training in Egypt, I knew how to crawl, and we crawled under the fence because it was not a very high area. It was only for children. But here we were, the group of half a dozen scientists and engineers. We had to crawl under that. Then we worked there till 10 or 11 o'clock at night, no problem at all. But we had to crawl back again. And this happened not just once, several times. Once we had to do tests all evening. And with the personnel of the agency. But still, the entrance people were told not to let anybody in through the entrance, so they obeyed the rules. So this is how it worked. It was very interesting for us to understand the culture. On one hand, they had a culture of obedience. They were afraid of doing anything against the rules. I remember when I wanted to visit the communication center, after we had visited the astronaut training center in Gagarin Space Center, I said, well, why don't we visit the center like Houston is, which is also outside of Moscow? And they said, but that's not on our agenda. I said, but can't we visit it? They said, well, we have to get permission. And they had to get permission from the head of the Russian space agency. It had to go all the way to the top. And I said, well, call him up. He said, we can't. He's talking with Yeltsin. He has a meeting. I said, till when is this meeting? They said, we don't know. The meeting lasted with Yeltsin till 11 o'clock at night. So I was only able to get through. Well, I couldn't talk with him. Another cosmonaut who spoke some English, called him up. And only at 11:30 at night, we got the permission. Of course, he said yes, no problem at all. He knew me personally. And of course, he was going to allow us in. He had visited us in Bremen, and we had a good time together. But they could only get permission from way up to the top, because this was not on their list of procedures and permissions. So they couldn't make a decision. So this was the level. They couldn't. But they knew how to get around a lot of the rules. So it was a very interesting thing to see how things worked. I won't spend too much more time, because then this talk is going to take us too long. I think I've already gone over time. I'll try to be quick. I think you are probably running out. Eh? Okay, let's go a bit more quickly. I could spend hours. This is the wonderful Casey, the equivalent of the American plane, but this was the Russian plane. I'm saying Russian instead of Soviet, doesn't matter. It's an Illusion 76, a huge plane. And unlike the 707 that the Americans had and the Airbus that the Europeans had, where they had a normal floor, this was specially designed with a low floor in order to allow for the full 4 meters on the inside. And to compare, the NASA plane is 2.5 meters high, as the Airbus is also. This was 4 meters. Wow! When you start a weightless experiment, you can really fly all over the place. And we will need, at the end, 5 minutes to show a film. I'll carry on, but then I'll interrupt me at some point, and I'll show this one film taken in this plane. So I'll carry on here. This was our Russian crew on the Mir 97 mission. And this, this mission itself will take me a whole evening. So it was, if you're talking of something exciting, it was exciting. They were ready to abandon the space station, but they finally got the fire under control. And regarding the leak, well, they cut all the cables, and I remember them telling me they took these huge, the cables are that thick because they're running cables with electricity and air and God knows what, and they had to isolate this chamber very quickly, this one part of the space station, the Mir station. So I remember them telling me, well, we put rubber gloves on, we figured we might cut a cable and get electrocuted. But they took the risk, and they cut everything and then closed the hatch, because there were so many cables, about 20 different cables that thick. Fortunately, because our experiment was by design a portable, remote-controlled experiment, which measured physiological parameters in a remote daisy chain, which each part could be carried separately, they were able to grab all these parts and take it out of the capsule. And they were actually able to continue the experiments in another part of the station because of the design of our experiment. But all the other experiments couldn't be rescued, only ours was. It was very fortunate, so we were able to send up a few more cables in the next mission, and they can continue doing some measurements. Wonderful. But this was the exciting things that were happening. Every time we figured this is the end of it, what are we going to do? We're even going to lose our, but we didn't. Some way, somehow, it worked through. I won't show you all the details, but there's a lot of damage done. We won't go into that detail. We'll carry on. And this shows you the difference, the space shuttle and the Mir station. The space shuttle is almost bigger than the entire Soviet Mir station. So the space shuttle was big. Mir station was tiny, really small. The Russian capsules were so small, they could fit into here, roughly. Typical Russian capsule landing is extremely small. So they were very, very, very small. They were not nothing fancy like the space shuttle, but they worked. Well, I won't go into that. This is the space shuttle, and this is just comparing the Soyuz and the space shuttle. When you see them separately, you think they're both about the same, but actually, big difference. It's a humongous thing what the Americans sent up there, but not quite so stable. This little thing here almost always works. This didn't. We had 2 bad accidents on that. So I came here to the Netherlands and joined the European Space Agency. I was called, actually. I did not pick coming here, but I was called, and I thought, oh, well, if I'm asked to work at the European Space Agency, well, why not? I had not really picked the Netherlands. I had not thought about it, but I thought if I'm going to live here, I'm going to go to Leiden, which is a beautiful city. So we spent our first 5 years in Leiden. I said, well, if I'm going to be there, then let me do that. And we got our bicycles, and that was a great thing. So it's a wonderful center. Well, everything worked okay until our first mission, which was a disaster. This was the STS-107 that flew in 2003, and as you may remember, it was a horrible accident where the shuttle came down and killed all the people on board. That was my first job in the human spaceflight, and then I joined telecommunications and innovative satellite applications, where we try to analyze how we can create. I joined a totally new program, create innovative applications that can utilize space infrastructure. I always liked try to do something new, so I was very excited about being called to join a special team working directly for the Director General of the Space Agency to start this new program. And then lastly, I worked in lessons learned, where I decided I would set up a lessons learned system, because I figured this is what the agency needs. We need to learn lessons from the past and not make the same mistakes over again. I not only did, I'll try to go forward a bit more quickly, I also participated privately in a sense, because I couldn't be doing all these things. I did some isolation experiments. We did one isolation experiment in Cologne. That was when I was working for space industry, but I got a contract with the agency to do that, to study crew who are being isolated and do experiments, psychological experiments on them, and see how they get along and fight with each other. And one of the experiments we did, we had the crew on almost 280 days, 11 and a half months or so, I think 300 days, 243 days, I think it was 10 months, 9 months. And we analyzed the problems of having 2 different crews, one international and one Russian, and it was very exciting. I won't tell you all about it, but because it would take too much time. But this is roughly the chamber we locked them up in, and I can assure you there were all kinds of problems. It was maybe another time I can give you a lecture about this. It's very exciting what happened, but we'll go on. This is the crew that we lost. I wrote a book about. I edited a book and wrote a bit about how we can settle on Mars, but I won't talk about that. And I did some lecturing at university, in International Space University and Concordia University, where I became a professor in applied human sciences. So it's very interesting how my career took me from nuclear physics to neurophysiology to applied psychology, which is applied human sciences, where I became a professor. So one can do different things. I was always interested in that area, and I started that work because I figured we have to understand what's happening psychologically with the crew. And because of my excitement and giving lectures, and I ended up teaching also at University College London in this domain of space psychology, and did some other lecturing. And afterwards, when I decided to quit human spaceflight, I started working in the domain of telemedicine with the European Commission, and we formed again the first time, the European Space Agency, the World Health Organization, and the International Telecommunications Union work together under the auspices of the European Commission on a project. It was the first time. It was very interesting. And NATO also decided to, join in a little bit and gave us some advice. So we really got into a number of very interesting international agencies working together. I was afterwards invited to the European Commission to do a training session with the new commission that came through on lessons learned, which is a very interesting topic. I won't talk about that now. And I have been invited to a number of different places. I was invited to Wuhan, China. Interestingly, in November 2019, when the plague broke out there. And I remember walking around the marketplace, in the live marketplace. And afterwards hearing, I said, oh, well, almost.
Now we know that's
So that was very interesting. I did make a course in learning from mistakes, which is being sold at Concordia University. And I did enter a little bit artificial intelligence domain. And then I was recently invited to the European Commission to give a lecture, and they told me talk whatever you want, and I talked about COVID times and lessons learned, but I brought in everything, including politics. It was a very controversial lecture. I thought they would be fairly annoyed, but they afterwards told me they liked my rocking the boat. So, as a matter of fact, I'm preparing my next lecture, which I'm a bit hesitant to give it because it's European crisis, and I think I have to wait a little bit until everything calms down, because I don't want to be kicked out of the country, because I tend to be very controversial in my views. This is my website. You can visit it. Just put Dr. Kass space and you'll get my website, and I'll give it to you later. And this is my YouTube channel. I didn't really mean to make it to be attractive, but I felt whatever lectures I had, I like recording, like I'm recording this one, because it's a pity sometimes people who haven't heard it can afterwards. I discovered I had a Wikipedia page, which surprised me, but anyway, that's one of those things that happen. And then I will give you maybe the last reference material, and then you can look at some of the stuff. I just do one little thing, and that is I think, just a minute, I'll make that full screen. So this is Russian Ilyushin 776, and it's a very unusual plane because it has windows at the bottom of the cockpit. It's one of the few planes in the world to have windows where there should be windows. Here you will notice it's all padded. Oh, you can look at the windows at the bottom and you can see the ground through them. Wonderful. Most planes you can only see the sky and the clouds. You can't see the ground. I don't know why they don't make planes like this one. Here we are in this, that's me on the ground trying to take pictures. And you see that there's a lot of space and you can see people even floating around. We're only showing the parts where people are in weightlessness. And you can see that you're high enough when you get out of the parabola, you have a carer, a security person trying to help, because otherwise if you come down with too much speed, you might knock some equipment and kill yourself or hurt yourself very badly. So I'm just showing a few parts of the weightless. It's just I've cut out the high G parts, which are not so interesting. And you see how we can float around, and you immediately kind of float. And here are our carers helping to bring us back down before the parabola gets into its high G phase. So you see that's sometimes a problem. Yeah? So I can't see well. Oh, that's me there, yes. So here we're trying again. But this is the fun part. So the experimental parts aren't are disinteresting. So this is the kind of thing we also did, and at the end of each flight, we did 1 or 2 parabolas for fun, so to speak, to enjoy and to have fun. It was very much when we worked with the Russians, that's the one thing we liked about it. They always tried to combine pleasure and work. You didn't just, you couldn't, if you ignored the pleasure part, you didn't get along with them. Afterwards, we had to get drunk on sufficient vodka because everybody had to say a toast. And you can imagine after 25 toasts, if there are 25 people around the table, how many glasses you have to drink, which is 25, in addition to the wine and the champagne beforehand, champagne beforehand, not the champagne. But it was enjoyable. We enjoyed the work. This is a huge, huge, huge plane, and this is the back of the plane, you'll soon see, which has just opened up, and it is opening up. It's just like a big mouth that opens up. And then this is how we carried our stuff out afterwards. That's me again with my keeping my head warm because it wasn't very cold, but maybe minus 10 or 15. But it was on a winter's day. So I must say it was a very exciting time, an adventurous time. I could spend days and evenings telling you anecdotes in each area, but there isn't time. So I think we will close this with the end of this film. Well, it's only a few more seconds as this huge hatch of this very old plane. I wondered how to get off the ground. They now have a newer one that they're using, but this was an ancient one which we used in those days. Some of those planes, I must say, were so old, even the passenger planes that I flew, that you would have, if you sat near the exit, you would have air flowing out. And I remember the table in front of me that opened up for my drinks. Well, I pulled it down and it came off in my hands, and I didn't know what to do with it. So this was when I went to the kitchen on the plane, I saw it was almost all burnt up with dark stuff because it was really, I mean, when you talk of bad condition, the insulation was coming out of the doors and windows. I mean, I was really worried when I flew, but the pilots flew very well. You could not feel the landing. They flew perfectly, but the planes were in awful condition. I remember I got to the airport and I got there so late I couldn't even board the plane. And then they, without any language or whatever, they rebooked me and we couldn't communicate at all in those days. Very exciting. Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll just close here.